welcome to our regular listeners. We have a special episode today. You'll probably recognize me. I hope it's been a little while. Hunter Marston, and with me today to discuss Southeast Asia. So first off is Elina Noor, who is the Director of the Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Elina has written phenomenal work on technology, politics, and economics of Southeast Asia, with special focus, if I'm not mistaken, on Malaysian politics, but really a true expert of the region. Next, we have Evan Laksmana, who is a senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and a non-resident scholar with Carnegie China, as well as the Lowy Institute in Sydney. Evan was previously a senior researcher with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, not to be confused with CSIS DC, and a visiting fellow with ICS in Singapore. And finally, Sebastian Strangio, old friend of the pod, and who's hosted in my stead before. Sebastian is the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat and has written a number of truly exceptional works on Southeast Asia, including most recently the book In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century, with Yale University Press. So welcome, everyone, and thanks very much for joining me today for this special episode.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Just to get started, in no particular order, I thought I would sort of kick things off by asking each of you to offer some thoughts about why Southeast Asia matters. So typically, as most of you may be aware, this podcast discusses international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and just sort of the state of international policy making from the undiplomatic perspective, of course. But we don't typically go too deep into Southeast Asia as a sub-region or wider region. And I think it might help just to frame the discussion if we could talk a bit about what is Southeast Asia, first off, but why does it matter, and why should listeners care about Southeast Asia in particular when we have war raging in Europe and U.S.-China competition across the globe? Anybody who wants to go first here? No particular order.
I mean, I can start, if that's helpful.
Please.
So you asked the question, what is Southeast Asia? And I think that warrants a whole discussion on a completely different podcast episode, right? Because we can go into what it all means, like Southeast of what, and really which perspective you're viewing Southeast Asia from. The name itself tells you a lot about how the region was viewed, probably continues to be viewed. But we won't go into that. I just wanted to lay the context. And I think the question of why Southeast Asia matters is well documented, right? We know that it's important for trade, it's important for technology increasingly. But I think the more important and silent questions are, who is it important for? And what is it important for? And that shapes a lot of the narratives that are floating around today. So I can go into that, but I don't want to dominate the question and the questions that I posed myself. I'll leave it to Evan and Sebastian for their thoughts as well.
Sure.
Evan,
thanks, Elina, for...
you go.
Sure. And I just want to say that I think Elina is absolutely right to pose those questions. In fact, I think increasingly one can even start to argue, just to be a bit of a devil's advocate here, maybe it doesn't matter in the way that some of the narratives are looking at US-China competition, for example, that the measurement now, whether or not Southeast Asia matters, is to the extent to which individual Southeast Asian countries will help or not help in the process of great power competition. So if viewed strictly from that lens, I think you are going to see privately more policy analysts maybe start to accept maybe Southeast Asia doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter that there needs to be a buy-in for the Quad, for example. Maybe it doesn't matter for how the US thinks about a military contingency with Taiwan. So in that sense, I think Southeast Asian states themselves have not been helping their case within the context of asserting their own agency and charting their own course. I think we are still very much under the illusion, if not the dream, that when it comes to US-China competition, for example, that the idea US and China can still work together in Southeast Asia is a goal to be achieved, when in fact for many outside the region that is probably a non-starter. So maybe it is time to actually really ask that question. If it does it matter for our own sake? Or if you look at it only from the perspective of US-China competition, then I can see why for some it doesn't really matter what Southeast Asia wants or what Southeast Asia thinks the trajectory of the region should be, because they themselves have not been trying to fundamentally shape the region.
Right. There's not a lot really for me to add to these illuminating comments. I suppose, just branching further from what Ibn was saying, I mean, during the Cold War, the original Cold War, what Southeast Asia wanted was, not in many cases, not really taken into consideration. I mean, these nations were viewed by both sides as, as pawns, as chess, squares on a chessboard, and and very often that involved, I got my start as a journalist working in Cambodia, and Cambodia perhaps is the paradigmatic example of the proxy, Cold War proxy, but the great power competition that engulfed the region during that time was something that really drew Cambodia in, and it was as a result the country was totally devastated. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of pose questions about, what it means to say that a country is important. We can definitely talk further about, from the Chinese perspective, why Southeast Asia is important, from the American perspective, why it's important, and potentially from others. But it's worth underlining, above all, that the region is important in and of itself. It's more than 600 million people, large economy. A lot of people's livelihoods and are kind of on the line here, and it's a large, significant chunk of the world's population that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's an important point to make, and many Americans, I speak as an American here, probably don't realize the significance of Southeast Asia collectively to their own economy. And I wanted to sort of connect a point that Evan made here regarding what's sort of a tension through the outside powers framing and looking at Southeast Asia in a sort of utilitarian sense. I look at the Biden administration's rhetoric of Southeast Asia as critical, Southeast Asia matters, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, collectively represents an important partner for the U.S. on its own grounds and not as part of U.S.-China competition. But as Evan noted, major powers, including Australia, Japan, and India, and the United States, are going around ASEAN to form minilateral minilateral institutions like the Quad, as sort of a way to find alternatives to security partners and providers, as well as providers of other public goods that don't are not slowed down by the sort of Southeast Asia bloc as a whole. So is there an inherent contradiction there, or is this just sort of the natural way of things in geopolitics?
Well, I think from my end, when it comes to these unilateral arrangements, I think first of all, Southeast Asian states themselves have had a long experience of unilateral arrangements. The Malacca Strait Patrol is a unilateral arrangement. The Sulu Sea Patrol Cooperation is also a unilateral arrangement. We've also had economic unilateralism. But I think what is different about the kinds of US-anchored unilateralism that we've seen, like the Quad or AUKUS and others, is probably the notion that these new arrangements are speaking about a broader set of regional order questions, whether it's norms exercise or public goods provision. And I think that's something that ASEAN has never really had to contend with anybody with before. So I think that's why things are slightly uncertain from the perspective of Southeast Asian states. But on the other hand, those who advocate for Quad and AUKUS and others would say, well, this is two separate baskets, and we're just pushing for a particular type of cooperation among existing regional powers, nothing to do with ASEAN. And so maybe it's not really important whether or not Southeast Asian states or ASEAN support Quad or AUKUS, because it will still do their own thing. And I think that's all perfectly fine, except that the Southeast Asian states themselves are now essentially, by default, maybe surrendering some of that regional order maintenance outside of the region, rather than making sure that ASEAN can be revitalized and actually go back to its original role of the shaper of regional security architecture. And this is where I think the domestic trends in the individual Southeast Asian countries have been probably stronger than they are at the regional side of things. So when the priorities for regional order making is not in the minds of domestic policymakers, are we surprised that other bigger powers now start to dominate the way regional security building has been done? So I think it is a natural progression of things. I'm not saying it's ideal, but I think the sooner we accept that reality and try to do something about it is probably better for Southeast Asians.
I think it also reflects a certain, I don't know if disdain is the right word, but a frustration with the fairly sluggish, time-sluggish processes of ASEAN, and forging, the attenuated process of forging a regional consensus around issues like this, or the question of whether Southeast Asian states have different emphases from, say, the United States and its Quad partners about what exactly a rules-based order, constitutes. And so there's a certain sense in which, because ASEAN is not throwing its lot in as a block with, the Quad's way of looking at things, which is very security focused, despite sort of recent initiatives that are branching into public goods provision and economic areas. That basically these sort of so-called like-minded nations need to sort of move forward on their own, and that they can't really rely on ASEAN. But as Evan says, I think it's probably a vacuum that ASEAN has sort of created through its own, I suppose, lack of vision or being able to play this role itself.
The other variables, of course, are time and personalities, right? If you look at some of the regional initiatives that Evan mentioned, those arose as a response to particular urgencies at the time, and they've endured, like the Malacca Strait Patrol. But also, they happened at a time when maybe certain leadership personalities were stronger and more invested in those issues at that particular point in time. And we may see this happen, of course, in the future, perhaps with other issues. So I think it fluctuates as well with what's going on in the region at the time, whether there is political will and commitment to move ahead with some of these minilaterals, whether to be invested in some of the extra regional initiatives, minilaterals that are ongoing as well. So a lot of moving parts to the target, whatever that target might be.
While we're talking about ASEAN, in 2019, ASEAN collectively adopted the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific as generally understood as a response to these outside or major powers' own Indo-Pacific visions, free and open Indo-Pacific rhetoric from the likes of Japan and the Trump administration in Washington, D.C. What should we make of ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific? Is that an actionable item, or is it more just ASEAN's sort of rhetorical claim to relevance? Do you have any thoughts on that, Elina?
I think it was a response to the narrative that was beginning to reshape conversations around the region. So the whole nomenclature of Asia Pacific turning into the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN had to respond, and rightly so. But I wish that ASEAN was a little more dynamic and robust in its response. What was laid out in the few pages of ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific was fine. I think it sets a backdrop for future, more concrete initiatives. Actually, some of them are ongoing, but really, it's essentially that. It's just a response. And if you look at the document itself, the Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the language mentions both Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific, which leads or lends to some ambiguity about how ASEAN member states really feel about the changing of the terminology from Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific. And there are still references to Asia Pacific depending on the circumstances and situations. So it seems as if ASEAN was compelled to have a response, but wasn't quite sure how to respond.
Yeah, even accepting the terminology of the Indo-Pacific carries with it a certain assumption about, world order, and I mean that term is freighted with a lot of assumptions about, the sort of challenges posed by, these revisionist powers, China and Russia and various others, and it sort of implies almost a framing. The framing that the U.S. has adopted, a sort of, about this idea of the free and open order, set against the sort of closed and more authoritarian vision of world order that these other revisionist powers are seeking to create. And so I think a lot of Southeast Asian governments are ambivalent about, really both visions. And as a result, the outlook sort of tries to split the difference, to sort of warn about the growing mistrust between these two visions, or the advocates of these two positions, and warns against sort of a zero-sum form of competition. It's really sort of a further iteration, I think, of ASEAN's desire to sort of have its cake and eat it when it comes to questions of great power competition, sort of to maintain its economic relationships with China while also benefiting from the stabilizing, or at least in some cases stabilizing. I think Van would probably beg to differ on that question. Effect of U.S. security deployment to the region.
Right.
I think what's...
Sorry, Evan, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say that, what's I think kind of under developed, I think, is the right word perhaps to describe the essence of the ASEAN outlook. But the way that Indonesia had developed it before it became an ASEAN product was, I think, partially responsible for the way the document came out, which is not everybody, as Elina and Sebastian mentioned, not everyone in the whole of ASEAN agree that we need one to start with. And number two, I think it is true that the best case scenario at the time was that ASEAN outlook became a reference point, something that external powers can cite to when they're talking about Indo-Pacific. So at the time, the essence of the programs, the policies, the areas of cooperation, these are things that are not new. These are things that we've already agreed on. These are things that we've already worked on. And so this is not the invention of a new strategy or a new resource or a new implementing program. These are essentially a restatement with the proviso that there's now a wider set of lens, and that this becomes a reference point, so that when ASEAN deals with the US, when ASEAN deals with Japan, with Australia, everyone cites the ASEAN outlook rather than citing the free and open Indo-Pacific, rather than citing China's community of mankind or whatever. So I think initially, from that standpoint, that it becomes a reference point, I think that was relatively successful. But when it comes to actually shaping regional outcomes, clearly that is still far. This year, according as we've seen in the past few months, is the idea to mainstream the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is part of a few of the key products of the last summit in Cambodia. But this was obviously the way Indonesia wanted to do it. So essentially, mainstreaming the ASEAN outlook is a bureaucratic sleight of hand. Rather than developing new strategy and resources, what we want to do is relabel existing programs and activities as falling under the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, in, let's say, an ASEAN Maritime Forum, an ASEAN Regional Forum, you can have activities that falls under the rubric of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. And if there is a new thing, it would probably in the form of some sort of Indo-Pacific infrastructure summit or food summit. But there is certainly the idea that implementing the outlook is yet another event. rather than genuinely shaping the program. So from that standpoint, this is a par for the course. ASEAN is about sustaining and expanding the processes rather than shaping outcomes. So I think there's a lot left to be desired, but certainly now I think the way Indonesia has been moving on this is focusing on how to get the ASEAN outlook as a reference point with the dialogue partners. When in fact, I think the biggest challenge for ASEAN outlook is not the external partners; it's within ASEAN themselves. The gap between maritime and mainland Southeast Asia over the maritime-centric nature of the ASEAN outlook is still there. So I think it is a huge challenge, but the challenge isn't from external. I think it's from within ASEAN.
Mm. Well, I am reluctant to make this an ASEAN-heavy podcast, thinking that such sort of multilateralism and specific to the institution of ASEAN type content might be a bit lost on general listeners. But zooming out a bit to the issue of great power competition, ASEAN has talked about an open and inclusive regional order. But really, we see sort of competing visions, as Sebastian has noted, of what is a free and open Indo-Pacific, and open to whom and for whose rules. And while China has not really adopted the Indo-Pacific language itself, it's sort of acknowledged the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. But how has the region more generally reacted to great power competition? And just before I sort of close that question, there's an understanding of a general bifurcation that exists where the US has been sort of the security provider and China is the number one trader, major source of investment in the region now, and ASEAN states can sort of have their cake and eat it too. Is that bifurcation sort of overplayed, or does that generally hold? And that's sort of a broad set of questions there. Maybe I'll kick it to Elina if you want to start.
Yeah, I think a couple of things to unpack, right? The first is, as you mentioned, ASEAN has always been, or the Southeast Asia as a region has always been inclusive, or at least tried to be. And there's a question of whether the phrasing of a free and open Indo-Pacific actually includes that inclusivity bit, because there seems to be a dissonance sometimes in the rhetoric of a free and open Indo-Pacific with the practice of inclusion, or sometimes exclusion, as the case may be, based on certain conditions. And so I think there is a bit of complex unpacking for ASEAN to do when it hears this rhetoric of open Indo-Pacific, and how itself, ASEAN, Southeast Asia as a region, should react and respond to it with its own initiatives. I think the other thing to unpack, of course, is how the phrase free and open Indo-Pacific translates into not just English in the context of different countries in Southeast Asia, but in the local languages of each of these countries in Southeast Asia. And I think this is a point that's often overlooked, because we assume we're all talking about the same thing. We speak English to each other at international forums. We're speaking English right now. But English is, of course, not every country in Southeast Asia's first language. And for me, it'd be interesting to understand how the term free and open Indo-Pacific, or indeed any other term that seeks to shape a narrative about regional order, translates into a local language of a Southeast Asian country, and what it actually means for those people, or the policymakers of those particular countries, because they can mean very different things, and we can be talking across each other, sometimes with very subtle nuances, sometimes with great difference.
I think another factor that's, that complicates, I suppose, Southeast Asia's reception of this concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific is the fact that the free and open idea is very often paired with a framing of great power competition that privileges this sort of clash of ideologies, sort of the liberal democracy on the one hand and some sort of brand of authoritarianism on the other. Now, the fact that many Southeast Asian nations are not liberal democracies, in fact, you could maybe you could probably make the argument that none of them are consolidated liberal democracies. definitely complicates matters. And you have, in a lot of Southeast Asian, amongst a lot of Southeast Asian elites, a real resistance to, or sort of a distaste for being sort of, as they might see it, being looked down upon by Western powers, given the colonial history of the region. And so there's, that idea of free and open, also carries with it for some leaders in Southeast Asia, a potential threat that, does free and open refer to the domestic political arrangement of the particular country in question? And so that's sort of, that is also something that's been a factor, perhaps not so much for the maritime countries, but I know that it's certainly been an issue for some of the mainland countries. And, in addition to the questions about inclusivity in terms of the international order, it certainly, it also figures into the domestic context of some of these countries. And I might just add that, this is a way that Southeast Asia is important in a broader sense, to come back to the first part of our discussion, which is, Southeast Asia, with the potential exception of Singapore, although Singapore is also post-colonial, Southeast Asian nations are members of the global South. And so, how Southeast Asia sort of reacts to great power competition and seeks to position itself, also will reflect, it has relevance to sort of how African countries, or some African countries, might seek to position themselves, in the face of this Chinese push into Africa and the U.S. response, or some countries in Latin America. I just thought I'd append that on the end there. I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, I think the two key issues, I think, when it comes to the bifurcation as well as the inclusive regional order part, is number one, Southeast Asian states, I think a lot of the leaders still cling on the idea of compartmentalization, right? If I do more stuff with China economically, I should be able to do more stuff with the US militarily, right? So they're trying to compartmentalize engagement with the great powers in a way that they can exploit that competition for their own particular benefit. I think that's still the illusion that they cling on, that you can separate this domain for that great power, that domain for this great power. I think that's the first illusion. The second illusion is that I think the notion of inclusive regional order is great, and we all support that. But the concern is, at what point does inclusive regional order become strategic overcrowding, in which the agenda of the bigger powers actually set the tone and the points of discussion rather than those of the smaller powers? And this is where I think some in Southeast Asia still believe that ASEAN should still be useful, in that sense, that if the regional powers want to come and talk to us, they should follow the talking points and agenda of ASEAN as it's set by the Southeast Asian countries. But this is, I think, starting to be hit with reality. And I think this is where the concern, for example, like Malaysia and Indonesia over AUKUS, for example, right? So these are, I think, the kinds of issues when we talk about the bifurcation. It is something that's actually beneficial for some of the elites in the way they exploit their engagement and alignment with different parts of the US and China, but also figuring out at what point do we stop inclusive regional order from becoming strategic overcrowding.
The problem with that sort of bifurcation is it sort of assumes that countries are aligning one way in one domain and another in the other domain. But do you see examples of some states, frequently these days people will point to Cambodia or even Laos as sort of, indebted to China and therefore politically aligning with China. Do you see other countries sort of leaning out one way or the other? Even the U.S. allies, the Philippines and Thailand, are really sort of independent actors, free agents these days. So it's sort of hard to get a read. But I would argue that I don't think there's such a neat bifurcation, in that you don't see states just sort of sitting on the fence and aligning in a neat way one direction in one domain and in another in the other domain.
No, it's a neat oversimplification, and it's useful in sort of a broad sense to illustrate how the general tendency in the region is that the U.S. is more security focused and that China is more economically focused. But you're right. I mean, each nation has its own unique admixture of these two elements, and a lot of nations in the region would very much welcome greater economic interaction with the United States and a more forward thinking American economic vision for engagement with Southeast Asia.
I think what's challenging about that question is the implicit assumption that there's spillover. If I do stuff with you militarily, you will be aligned with us strategically beyond military, right? That's certainly the narrative coming out of Secretary Austin every time he talks to Prabowo, that they want interoperability as part of a bigger strategic realignment. And I think that's where the problem is, that there's an assumption that if you do stuff with us in one domain, it will lead to the other domains. But in reality, I don't think the leaders see it that way. I think the leaders simply say, yeah, I don't mind doing stuff economically with China in some issues. Sure, it will constrain us in other domains, but that's the risk. And it's the same thing with the military. So it's sort of having both sides, in which the US and China feels that having one domain cooperation can give them multi-domain alignment. And for the leaders themselves in the region, yeah, as long as we get the benefit, a cheaper product, when we try to play off one country over another, I don't care about the broader strategic realignment picture, even if that means from time to time, in the case of Indonesia, I would argue, we are sleepwalking into strategic alignment when it comes to external issues. So I think this is where the concern is that bit by bit, smaller policy-specific alignment in terms of coordination and cooperation collectively leads to a broader strategic realignment, even if we didn't consciously think about it as a cross-domain strategic realignment.
Mm.
I think this idea of being locked in through interoperability is quite a significant one, because just look at the history of Malaysia's defense procurement. It makes no sense at all strategically, with a mixture of acquisitions from different countries with competing interests and sometimes very adversarial goals. But in Malaysia's risk or threat perception is not the same as these other powers that have sold Malaysia these defense equipment. And so there is a bit of schizophrenia, if you will, in what goes on in the heads of policymakers who approve these defense decisions with the realities of the strategic environment. And it's not just for the time and day of when those decisions were made, but it's also thinking into the future. So in Malaysia's case, there's no interest in making China an adversary. And if we lock ourselves into certain defense purchases, then we're locking ourselves into an alignment that we might well regret in the future. And the same goes for other powers as well. Vice versa applies.
Elina, you mentioned threat perceptions, and that's interesting. Southeast Asia is huge geographically and also incredibly diverse. And Sebastian mentioned the difference between maritime and mainland Southeast Asia. Perhaps collectively we could sort of address that issue. What are the primary threat perceptions? Elina, I think you mentioned that Malaysia doesn't want to make an adversary of China. I think that's probably true of nearly every country in Southeast Asia. But are we focused too much on this sort of US-China prism, and are there other threats that are at play here we should be aware of?
When I was based in KL, and I often got asked this question by foreign visitors, my answer would always be the same, and I don't think it's changed at all. The number one threat perception for a country like Malaysia, arguably for some of the countries in Southeast Asia, has always been internal. The national cohesion or lack thereof has been the number one risk to security for a country like Malaysia. Because without a cohesive state of the nation, there is no state or a nation to defend against external threats. And so I would argue that continues to be probably the most important point in terms of risk perception for a country like Malaysia.
I'm sure Evan can expand on that in the case of Indonesia as well, with the various regional uprisings and separatist rebellions that the Republic has faced since independence. The Philippines probably similarly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the majority of how security leaders in Southeast Asia, and certainly in Indonesia, on a day-to-day basis, they are very much thinking about internal security. sure, some of the new, shall we say, operational challenges has been a little bit cross-border, like illegal fishing, drugs, etc. But by and large, the primary lens remains internal security. Of course, there are long-term strategic challenges when it comes to certain parts of the territory that may be open to incursions, like the maritime domain, and that brings up uncomfortable questions about, well, do we start to worry more about our neighbors and stuff like that? Certainly, it's there, and certainly within ASEAN themselves, there are unresolved border, both on land and maritime, that remains to be resolved. So if you look at the landscape of the threat perception, I think you would say that U.S.-China a competition, or China maybe in terms of actual military threat perception, probably will not rank high in terms of the day-to-day stuff, right? But strategically, of course, everybody understands that the region is changing, that China poses a challenge, etc. But it hasn't been very uh, dominant enough to overcome a lot of the internal security considerations on a daily basis, I think.
It's also, I think this also speaks to a broader set of priorities that Southeast Asian governments have that, are focused on domestic development. You see leaders like Jokowi in Indonesia, recent Malaysian leaders, well, really, in virtually every part of the region, generating economic development in order to, create a sense of, economic legitimation is very important for many governments in the region. And so economic relationships with China are very important. In some places that takes less high-minded forms. And, it's worth mentioning that in countries like Cambodia or Myanmar, the decisions of individuals that are prominent in the governments of these places, have mean a lot. And I think in these two particular cases, simple regime survival and is a very important goal. And that also comes with a certain threat perception attached to it, which is a threat of external, i.e. Western intervention or sanctions that might destabilize the current ruling arrangements. And so that also, there are threat perceptions that also reflect the interests of entrenched elites in certain places.
Yeah, I think you get at something interesting there. And I've actually recently been thinking about this and sort of analyzing Cambodia and Myanmar's foreign policy decisions in tandem. And I think one common thread is that neither really faces a genuine external threat, but the major threat is the internal security dynamic. Actually, for Cambodia, that's not exactly true. But the politics renders it such that Hun Sen can exercise sort of unilateral control over its foreign policy. And therefore, Phnom Penh's alignment is basically subject to one man's decision, which arguably is true in the case of Myanmar as well. Maybe we should talk about Myanmar a bit. This unresolved crisis. There was a coup in the beginning of 2021. ASEAN has sort of more or less failed to mount a collective response to the situation. Indonesia just took up the chair of ASEAN, though. Is there any hope for a solution in the next year, or at least sort of a drawdown in violence and perhaps some diplomatic talks?
I don't see it, but I wonder what my co-panelists think.
Well, I mean, I think there is a growing realization in Jakarta that, the first thing is no one foresees a condition under which the crisis will be solved within 1 year. I think there's an acceptance that any issue of ASEAN's engagement with Myanmar is not a 1 year thing, and it's certainly not ideal if it's every year. Every chair has different approaches, right? So I think right now the mood is trying to find a long-term roadmap to engage Myanmar beyond the 5-point consensus, beyond just the 1 year deliverables of visits or aid delivery or ending violence. Because at the end of the day, we are gradually accepting that we failed in actually fully integrating Myanmar into ASEAN when Myanmar first joined. So there needs to be a rethink of how we want to do this and commit ASEAN resources and planning long-term beyond just 1 or 2 chairmanship. Number 2, I think there's also a growing realization in Jakarta that probably it is time to understand that when we say inclusive stakeholders, we don't just mean SAC versus NUG or NUCC, but we also need to start bringing in the ethnic groups. And this is something that not many of us in the region, and certainly not in Indonesia, fully understand the complexity of engaging with different ethnic groups. What are their thoughts on elections, on federalism, etc. So I think there is a slow process in that sense. So for me, Indonesia's success of chairmanship when it comes to Myanmar isn't the short-term resolution of the crisis and the current violence, but can Indonesia lay a long-term framework and engagement that commits ASEAN to engage Myanmar beyond just the one chairmanship, beyond just the short-term aid delivery, but to fully start and facilitate the inclusive dialogue, etc. Of course, we cannot do much in terms of 50 years of nation building, etc. But in terms of making sure that there are implementable benchmarks and roadmaps in which we can see that there's progress on dialogue, etc., that is probably the best that we can hope for. To say that Indonesia can come as 1 year of chairmanship, and bearing in mind that 1 year is actually a lot shorter when you consider that the runway for the deliverables for 2 summits is basically only 1 or 2 months, right? The first foreign ministers retreat is in late Jan. Then we have to get ready for the summit perhaps in March or April. In April or May, and then the second summit in November. When you look at that runway, and when you consider the other priorities that Indonesia has had, I think it still seems unrealistic to expect Indonesia to solve the crisis. But if Indonesia can develop that long-term engagement roadmap, I think that would be the best that we could do at our current time.
Of course, all this sits downstream of what happens in the country itself. I mean, and on that front, I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to get a good sense of exactly like the balance of battlefield sort of, successes, because you have, the NUG, obviously, like the Ukrainians at the moment, they have an incentive to sort of, shall we say, emphasize the positive and downplay sort of setbacks. And obviously the same applies for the military junta as well. And it's very hard to get a good sense of exactly, how close is the military government to some form of collapse, or is it in a state that it has enough power and access to resources that it can survive in this sort of semi, stable state, more or less indefinitely. So like it's very hard to sort of establish an outlook for the coming year. I mean, my guess would be that the conflict will continue and perhaps settle into the sort of rhythm we've seen throughout this year of rebel attacks and government, vicious military reprisals. And then, of course, there's the election that the junta is planning to hold this year, and I suppose that's a huge challenge for Indonesia and ASEAN as a whole. How do they respond to, as a collective, to this election? The former Malaysian Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah he wrote a piece in the Jakarta Post yesterday or the day before saying that the election would be a sham and that it would only worsen the situation in Myanmar. But will that same position, will that same view be, prevail in somewhere like Hanoi or in Phnom Penh or in even Bangkok? It's going how ASEAN handles that election, whether to accept it or not, or to what extent to accept it, will be an interesting thing to watch out for.
And I've seen Scott Marciel, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, as well as a sort of heavyweight authority on Southeast Asia more generally, advocating ASEAN to take a position early on.
He's been strong on that, yeah.
Announcing the Myanmar junta's election, or what Marcus Brand at IDEA, International Something for Election Assistance, has called an electoral performance. It's not, he doesn't want to grant it the legitimacy of an election, right? How do you stage an election across the country when it's at war with itself? And the junta arguably does not control the majority of territory across the state. But looking more beyond ASEAN, who is protecting Myanmar's junta? Do China and Russia really play an important role in sort of guaranteeing regime survival there, or is it mostly just limited to its ability to survive on the battlefield? The country's economy has completely plummeted, and somehow the junta has managed to stay in power thus far.
Oh, well, I mean, the thing I suppose to mention is that they have a lot of practice at, first of all, surviving this sort of isolation from the West, you know, and there are, you know, there is a massive shadow economy in Myanmar, and there has been for many decades, you know, to do with the movement of resources from outlying regions, you know, conflict zones of the country, to markets in China and further afield. I mean, China, of course, is right there, so things just move across the border quite frictionlessly. Similar to a lesser extent with Thailand, and so, you know, to a certain extent, China is, you know, can be said to be, you know, because it's not denouncing the military junta, that it's supporting it. And of course, China's one point made by the opposition movement within Myanmar is that China's claim to non-interference is really bogus in this case, but because by backing the junta, it is in fact interfering, and making a decision about who to support within the country. And I think, you know, you can focus on China and Russia as being, you know, the sort of the big bogeyman of the international order, I suppose. But, you know, India isn't continuing to engage with Myanmar. The Japanese are, you know, eschewing the path of sanctions that the Western nations have chosen. Thailand, which shares a long border with the country, has remained committed to a policy of pragmatic engagement and so on. So I think actually the countries doing the isolating, which are really the Europeans and the Americans, North Americans, and even the Australians have sat out, you know, imposing really serious sanctions. You know, in many ways, they're the exceptions rather than the reverse.
Even within ASEAN, right, the empathy meter towards Myanmar and its junta ranges from complete disgust to, well, we understand what's going on. And so it's very, in a way, it's easy to point fingers at outside players like China, like Russia. But I think even within ASEAN, certain countries deserve a certain level of scrutiny that often does not happen. So it's complicated, obviously, but I think given the great power competition backdrop, it's always easiest to point fingers at certain large players rather than to look at some of these other smaller players, but really important ones with regard to what's going on in Myanmar.
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is another one that should be mentioned. Is, you know, sort of the offshore financial haven for a lot of junta money, and yeah, it plays a very important role.
No, I just want to say that I fully agree with Elina in the sense that Myanmar is 100% the responsibility of Southeast Asian states and ASEAN. We can blame it all we want towards external powers, you know, but this is not the same category as the South China Sea, for example. This is 100% an ASEAN problem and an ASEAN responsibility. So it is, I think, incumbent upon the individual Southeast Asian states to actually do something about it. But you know, the trend actually has been towards a lot more bifurcation, if not polarization, when it comes to Myanmar, rather than sort of the rather collective agreement on how to move forward from a year ago, right? So it's certainly in the last meeting, you know, the Dawn, the FM of Thailand, tried to organize over Boxing Day. That actually made it even worse. Everybody hated that meeting because it wasn't an official ASEAN meeting. They wanted us to meet with Wuna, which is not a thing that we wanted to do. So we're not seeing
the foreign minister.
Yeah. Right. So we're not seeing a convergence of ASEAN in this matter. We're actually seeing a divergence. And I should note that, you know, I think in Jakarta, the realization itself is that if we wanted to do something as ASEAN chair, we cannot do it without Thailand. Mm-hmm. There cannot be a Myanmar option without Thailand, right? So even then, our relationship is not that great with Thailand. So the fracturing of an already fragile consensus to begin with from ASEAN, I think is getting worse. And I think this is where Indonesia's constraints and challenges would be this year.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting back to that sort of classic division between maritime and mainland Southeast Asia. You mentioned the South China Sea, and you know, early on in the COVID pandemic, it seems like China sort of took advantage of the pandemic to make some moves and coalesce its claims. But when I was in Singapore more recently, policymakers there were generally telling me that, you know, the focus across the region is no longer really on the South China Sea. Things have been fairly quiet there, and now the region is more preoccupied with tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Generally speaking, Speaker of the House, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan in September, I believe, I've forgotten exactly when that took place, was seen as a sort of needless provocation, poking China, and predictably leading to the really aggressive reaction that Beijing had, sending incursions over Taiwan's medium air defense identification zone. Is that generally the state of play in Southeast Asia? Is the South China Sea no longer the sort of flashpoint that it was only a few years ago?
I think the flash continues to be there. It's just that it hasn't been getting a lot of publicity. There are still incursions. There's still IIU fishing going on. Those things still remain. They just haven't had the publicity that they've had in the past. And as for the Taiwan Strait, I don't see a lot of internal discussion on this in Malaysia. I'm here right now. I don't hear a lot of it in Southeast Asia in general. I do hear some of it being discussed among Filipino commentators, for example. So I wonder how much of it is an imposed conversation on the region rather than actual urgent worry about Taiwan Strait erupting into a hot conflict.
Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with international attention. I mean, the Ukraine war has dominated a lot of Western discussion of the fate of the globe. That has really, Russia's return to this sort of arch bogeyman position, for good reason, let me add. That's led to the Myanmar crisis sort of fading from the headlines. I mean, I think it was probably inevitable that it would anyway because of the limited attention span of the international press. But yeah, I mean, I think the Cambodians during their chairmanship of ASEAN last year were in some sense lucky that, the Ukraine conflict and the Myanmar crisis were so prominent in the agenda that it sort of, the South China Sea was there was pro forma sentences about restraint and so forth in the various statements that were released during the chairmanship, but it didn't really dominate to the same extent that it did during the chairmanship that Cambodia had in 2012, which of course coincided with the Scarborough Reef standoff between China and the Philippines and was highly controversial as a result.
Yeah, I think to pick up on Elina's point, I think it's certainly there are quiet, private, and perhaps in some cases fringe discussions, certainly on contingencies like Taiwan. It's not like the most talked about issue, certainly in places like Indonesia, when we have other stuff going on. And bearing in mind for Indonesia, this year is a campaign year as we move towards the election in 2024, Valentine's Day, easy to remember. But what's interesting about Taiwan, and I think this may or may not come up during Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN, is this concern about reviving a version of zone of peace, of freedom, and neutrality, subfund. Because the idea is if there were to be contingencies happening around Taiwan Strait, what about Southeast Asian states who do not want to be part of it, but also would not like it to see their waterways and airspace be used by belligerents, right? And whether or not this leads into an actual anti-access strategy or so far, that's a separate debate. But the concern over Taiwan is not just about Southeast Asian citizens in Taiwan, which are a lot, hundreds and thousands of Southeast Asians in Taiwan, and that's the first priority. But the second priority is to what extent will Southeast Asian states be asked to support, facilitate, or even just let their airspace and waterways be used by belligerents? And I think this is something that in Jakarta has been talked about, and there are clearly some within the foreign policy establishment would like it that we can revive ASEAN instruments for that purpose in terms of sustaining its neutrality, etc. But I think this is still not yet reaching the proportion of what South China Sea was for Southeast Asian states over the last 2 decades in terms of shaping fundamentally how we not just look at China, but how we look at the maritime domain, our strategic assessment, and so forth. But it's certainly not as fringe as we think it is. But with new issues coming up, I think it will come back to the fringe.
Yeah, all points very well taken. Thank you all. To get back to this framing of great power competition in the region and the alignments that we've discussed, Sebastian drew a lot on the history of the region with the Cold War, and there's this common trope in Washington, at least there was just a couple of years ago, about this era of a new Cold War. It's time to sort of adopt that mindset and competitive footing with China, but also Russia. Clearly the U.S. is greatly preoccupied with Russia's threat in the European mainland, and Southeast Asia has a lot of concerns about great power competition. How much do you think is it fair to draw parallels with the Cold War, or is today's region far more multipolar, and the struggle in Southeast Asia between great powers taking place on a different level, different domain that will not lead to interstate war or intrastate war like the Cold War did?
I've always been a skeptic of the Cold War analogy. I think it speaks to our, the constant misuse of historical analogy and a lot of discussion about international affairs. I mean, if you define the Cold War as a great power competition that doesn't involve direct war between the great powers involved, then I guess you could say it's a Cold War. But there's a lot of other specifics about the original Cold War that have not been reproduced in this case. I think Bilahari in Singapore Bilahari Kausikan, former Singaporean diplomat, has been very strong on this, that it's a much more complex strategic environment. There are a lot of other serious players in the region, economic players and security players, that complicate this sort of bipolar or biochrome image of a duochrome image of great power competition in the region, and as a result will give Southeast Asian countries potentially more room for maneuver because there's more various outside players, and even close partners and allies of the United States have their own interests that diverge in some respects from those of Washington, even if they overlap on a lot of the fundamentals.
No, I agree with Sebastian's point that this is much more complex than the Cold War, etc., and that's certainly the reality that we face. But I do think it is hard for policymakers who are probably, whether we like it or not, occasionally less sophisticated in their understanding of regional politics. But in that sense, I think it is an easier analogy to come back to, in the sense that our choices, it's not just two, obviously, but we're also not sure if we want a third choice, let's say from the Europeans or something else. But it's certainly it's more about the push and pull factor, right? Rather than necessarily whether it's being pushed by one or two polars in that sense, because it is reminiscing of the Cold War in the sense that our agenda is not our own. What we wanted to do are things that are different than what the external powers wants us to do or think about. In that sense, I think there are some things that Southeast Asian policymakers feel eerily familiar to the Cold War era. It may not be the same type of strategic equation and countries, but the notion that we are not in control of our own agenda is certainly quite familiar for Southeast Asian policymakers.
To continue Sebastian's analogy about colors, I think the palette of the strategic environment is a lot more multi-hued, right? But it also, as Evan mentioned, I think this binary choice that powers say they're not forcing Southeast Asian countries into is a little different in reality, with things like friendshoring or reshoring. And that's going to continue to make its mark in the next 5, 10, even longer years, with things like technological standards and the decoupling of those, as well as decoupling of economic relations. So the options are getting narrower, and this is it harkens back to Cold War times in a way, even if it's very different from how it was back in the day.
Good. So, ending on a complex note, I suppose, the outlook is neither completely dark nor entirely positive. I think, just to sort of wrap up here, perhaps we'll do a lightning round in, again, no particular order, and just look at any bright points you see on the horizon for 2023, or conversely, any major issues which have you concerned. And if you need a minute to think, you don't have to step up to the plate right away. I realize I sprung this question on all of you. But anything that comes to mind here, just for listeners to be aware of in 2023.
God, it's difficult. There's so many moving pieces, and a year is such an arbitrary delineation of time.
Let me be biased here and say that for me, things to look out for are not external events, but domestic politics, because I feel like the elections in Southeast Asia this year and next year, Cambodia, Thailand, and then Indonesia in February of 2024, I think will be the catalyst rather than external events such as, which has always been bad. I don't remember a year in which there's no bad things happening in Southeast Asia. But I think the leadership is very much determined by the election results, and the readiness to respond will be very much shaped by who wins. So for me, I would look out for the elections in Southeast Asia.
I'm optimistic about Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN, actually, and the ability to carve the region's agenda in the face of strategic competition. And we saw a piece of this last year with 3 really world summits converging on Southeast Asia. Indonesia, of course, was one of those hosts, G20, with Thailand and Cambodia being the other hosts of APEC and ASEAN and ASEAN-related meetings. So I think we've been given a peek into what Indonesia is capable of for the region. No pressure for Indonesia, Evan, but I'm optimistic that Indonesia will be able to steer the region through and push through Southeast Asia's own agenda in the face of pressures by external powers.
I suppose convening world leaders in a setting like Bali has a natural advantage, except for whatever happened to Lavrov when he got off his plane. A bit of mystery remains there. But Bali perhaps conducive to positive diplomatic relations.
I would say, to come back to the question of, optimism or pessimism, I've always, when it comes to Southeast Asia and great power competition and the challenges facing the region, I've always tended to have a pessimist's optimism, I suppose you might say, about the region's ability to sort of dodge and weave and to forge its own middle path. As we've discussed today, I think it's getting a lot more complicated as time goes by, and it seems like the U.S. and China are, seemingly on a path toward greater competition and more heated competition, if not confrontation. And things will get more difficult. But I do think Southeast Asians are, they have a lot of practice at sort of managing these sorts of situations. And I think that there is a certain diplomatic instinct to balance and to try and find space in the interstices, I suppose, between the great powers. And obviously, if it comes to an open U.S.-China conflict, I think a lot of that space disappears. But short of that, I think that I'm fairly optimistic that there will be that Southeast Asian nations will manage to preserve that zone of autonomy. Now, the question, I suppose, the reason I say I'm a sort of pessimist's optimist is that, when it comes to questions of, internal democracy in Southeast Asian countries. I see trends kind of moving in the wrong direction in a lot of places. And I've long been pessimistic about, how even in countries where democratic systems are functioning fairly well, how deeply those norms have penetrated, given that a lot of these nations are very young, and democratic norms and institutions need, in the West, they developed over generations. And so, because a lot of discussion of Southeast Asia is framed in the West in sort of, the talk of how democracy is faring in the region, I thought it was worth to mention that, things, I don't see a huge amount of bright spots, except perhaps Anwar in Malaysia. I think that was, probably one of the most positive stories of last year.
Right. Well, you mentioned concerns for democracy in Southeast Asia. I'm not so certain we shouldn't have concerns about democracy elsewhere, such as in the United States. I'm sitting in Australia where things are far more tranquil and the civil discourse is a lot more civil. Some other dark spots on the horizon, far closer to those Western democracies that are often looking critically at Southeast Asia. Well, gang, it's been over an hour. I think perhaps we'll wrap up here. I want to thank each of our speakers again very much for taking the time to join us today. It's been an outstanding discussion. I really appreciate the nuance and depth of your expertise and contributions to the conversation today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Good seeing everyone.
You too.
Take care.
Yeah, all the best.
Bye.
Hope your neck